There we go. Um, as I was saying, there'll be some overlap because this pericope is really part of the same section, the same incident where Jesus went. Um, Basically, he departed. Well, actually, not quite. One, he's being asked in the grain, actually, and this is the synagogue, but they are related. One occurs probably in sequence with the other, and so there will be some overlap. I know for a split second you didn't hear any sound. That should be coming up in just a second. There's a sound visual delay that was created when I started this. And so these are related. They're not directly related. And by the way, that's what alters the pericope at that time is at the beginning of chapter 12. And now begins the pericope that we're going to be dealing with tonight. It's a short pericope, but we have an additional feature that we've added on. And so I want to see how this kind of goes. I even thought that at some point longer broadcasts would be possible as far as this particular feature and build on it as something extra, not pulling it away from this, but maybe spin off. And so we're going to get started very shortly here. I don't know what it looks like as far as the video field now with other folks, but I know that sometimes those who don't tune in right now end up joining us. And it is a Thursday. So let me switch over to our PowerPoint and get to the beginning of this. I'm really letting you see too much at once, right? And so this is going to end up showing here. You may for a split second see a little bit more than you expect to see, but that's perfectly okay. And so we'll actually end up being all set here. There was a little bit of a glitch. We're going to look at Jesus's response to the Pharisees some more. Now, what's going on here is the opposition is building. And so you're going to see that opposition continue to build. 13, we're going to kind of get into with the hardening of the Pharisees in one particular instance, and it's a real hard hardening. And you then begin to see the use of parables, and there's a reason for this. So we're getting to this kind of building opposition, and then we see Jesus's response to this opposition and how things go, leading to the eventual execution of Jesus. And I'm sorry, just need a little bit more oxygen. And so let's start with this new feature that we're going to end up doing. Now, this was suggested. Steve, shout out to you. This was suggested by you. And so I thought I would go ahead and do it. I'm calling it a Nosh of Hebrew. So if you're watching this later, you will be introduced to a Nosh of Hebrew. All right. Good to see another person in the house. This is our new little feature that I'm throwing in. It may become a longer separate feature. It doesn't mean it has to leave here. It just may become here and something greater. But we're calling it a Nosh of Hebrew. A nosh in Yiddish is a little taste, a little bite. You don't want to eat a full meal, you have a nosh. And so this is a nosh of Hebrew. And actually, it was one of you out there that suggested it. If you make suggestions like this, I will try to incorporate them. I love new ideas, and I will work on making this work. So you can tell me how a nosh works for you. Maybe you could have a nosh and a full meal later. In dealing with a nosh, we're going to get a taste. You should see a Hebrew word come up here. We're going to look at a word and the concept. And one of the things that I didn't do as much when I was getting Hebrew is we didn't talk about the range of meanings and how they fit together. And so I would sometimes be very wooden in my translation. And when I was going to Hebrew school, we didn't really learn a range of meanings. What we learned was just basically kind of a basic meaning, but not a range of meanings. particularly because we're dealing with the prayer book. It would be the meaning that was fit into the Hebrew text. And so now, as I've gotten more mature in my studying and continuing to use Hebrew, I started to get fascinated by some of the ways the range of meanings for a word can end up occurring and how that word's used. So our word for tonight is shamar. Its basic root is to exercise great care over. So that's the central concept that's going to hold the range of meanings together. Um, and so how do we get that? Well, how is it used? What does that range do? Well, you could exercise great care over something by observing or practicing it, and that's why the word shamar is sometimes used in terms of practice. Um, to keep the Sabbath, shamar is the root. It's understood as observing the Sabbath, to keep certain commandments, where God says, if you keep my commandments. Shamar is the key word there, and it has the idea of, uh, again, exercising care. But in what way exercising care? Well, in those usages of this particular Hebrew word, you're exercising care by practicing it, by observing it, so it stays, so it is not lost. And so shamar is used that way. But shamar can be used in terms of exercising care through protection or preservation. And that's another way that shamar is used. So you have this central concept, and then you have a range of meanings that extend out of the central concept. And so I could exercise great care over something by protecting it, by preservation of it, not necessarily observing it, but in sense of keeping my household. I protect my household. I preserve my household through provision. Let's look at one of these usages, and I picked shamar because I think it's a wonderful word for us to think of right now. During this COVID crisis, a verse that has always had great meaning for me um, is connects with the word shamar. In fact, sometimes I get rid of my Hebrew Bible just when I wish I had it. Um, and I used to know it musically. Sometimes musically it comes back, but Psalm 121, 4 and 5. Uh, he that keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. The Lord is your keeper. Okay? Shomer. Shomer is from Shamar. He is your keeper. The Lord is the shade at your right hand. Shomer Yisrael. He is the keeper of Israel. He who keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. That word shamar is used over and over again in this particular psalm. Now, is it God observing or practicing here? Well, it's not God observing or practicing. This is in the sense of protection. The Lord is your keeper. He's your protector. He's your preserver. He's even your provider in the sense that he preserves you. The Lord is the shade, your shade at your right hand. And so this particular word appears several times in Psalm 121. And so this is your little nosh of Hebrew tonight. The Lord is your keeper, from the word shamar. He is the one that will to exercise great care over you. And in this sense, in protection and preservation. So it's a little nosh of Hebrew, but it's fun to look at a key concept and see the way it's used. One way in terms of the commandments, observing them and thus keeping them and preserving them. Another in the sense of the Lord being our keeper, the one who preserves and protects us, but not through observation or practice, but through direct care. And so that's your little nosh of Hebrew. And I have the song playing in my head. Hine lo yana vilo ishan Lo Yanam Velo Isha. And then the phrase Shomer Yisrael appears. So there you go. Well, at the end of our last pericope, we hit on a point that I can't avoid going back to, and it's very important we understand this point. There are all sorts of claims out there that Jesus never claimed to be God. Have you heard those claims? Muslims will use those claims. Show me one place where Jesus says he's God. And they will end up using those claims over and over again. Where does Jesus ever say he's God? Well, there are many indirect proofs. I've been able to use this sometimes in some conferences where I've spoke, which George Saig, who does Muslim ministry, but similar claims can be made on the Jewish end that Jesus was a good rabbi. He was nice. He was wonderful. He never claimed to be God. That's something that I just saw something funny. Not funny, haha. Just kind of brought a smile to my face. Um, how does he ever claim to be God? Where is this? He's just a nice guy. He was possibly misunderstood. And so before we move into the next pericope, let me use this time to pick up a point from Matthew chapter 12, verse 8. For the Lord of the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now you need to understand this claim. Um, you need to understand this claim because Jesus is not making a claim that he's just a good man at all. He is making a claim to deity. Now, why do I say these things? Rabbi Singer would be horrified. My grandfather might look at me weird. If that, why do I make this claim? Well, let's look at this. So why this is a claim. Now, by saying he's Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying he's the master. He's the possessor. He's the proper owner. He's the authority over the Sabbath. That's what he's literally saying here. That's what that idea of Lord entails. Who gave the Sabbath? And the Lord spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a graven image, any likeness in anything that is on earth above, or that is in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or that is in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow to them or serve them, for I am the Lord your God. Notice again, I am the Lord your God appears twice here, visiting the iniquity of the fathers, and it goes on to talk about the iniquity of the fathers on the third and fourth generations, but showing mercy to thousands who love me and keep my commandments. By the word is the word shomer. It's a form of the word shomer, which we just learned about tonight. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, I'm going to the 10 Commandments here, okay? But I'm going to the 10 Commandments for a reason. Who is Lord of the Sabbath? Who is the one that gave the Sabbath, that is his master, and that determines what the Sabbath means? I am the Lord your God. In fact, the rabbis believe quite clearly that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and the house of bondage is really the first commandment. They start counting from there. And their reasoning is if he isn't the Lord or God, there'd be no basis for him giving the other commandments and them being binding. And actually, I resonate with that. I think the rabbis have a very good point. And I think it's a worthwhile point. So I wanted to make this claim. When Jesus says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, he is saying he's equivalent to, I am the Lord your God. That's what he's claiming. He could not claim to be Lord of the Sabbath any other way. This is a claim of deity. If someone says, no, he's just claiming to be master of the Sabbath, the master of the Sabbath is the one that gave the Sabbath, commands the Sabbath, and determines the conditions of the Sabbath. Which, by the way, that is the Lord there. He's going to determine exactly what you can do on the Sabbath telling them not to work. And he is the one who gave the Sabbath, and he is the one in control of the Sabbath. And so Jesus' claim here is nothing less than a claim of deity. Muslim friend, if you were listening or are listening, if Jesus claims to be Lord of the Sabbath, he claims to be greater than Muhammad, who never gave the Sabbath, never initiated the Sabbath, never rested originally and creationally on the seventh day from the work of making new things, and so he is clearly God. Now let's get into the pericope. We're going to be looking at 12, 9 through 13 here. He was going through a field of grain and got picked on by the Pharisees. He gives a very strong defense on why it is not unlawful for his disciples to have been picking grain to meet their needs. This is a slightly different situation. It's not about the disciples' needs here, it's about doing good on the Sabbath. Okay? And so this takes it a little further. They're related, but there's a little bit more here in 9. Now, when he had departed, let me read the pericope first, and then we'll go through it. I think that's good for context, right? Now, when he departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they said to him, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So the issue now is the lawfulness of healing on the Sabbath, and they're putting it to him. But why are they putting it to him? Well, we'll get to that they might accuse him. And he said to them, what man among is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. All right? There's some good questions. Some of those questions relate to last week, and actually, we spent a lot of time on Jesus's reasoning last week. I don't mind at the end, you may be doing a quick review, but I would encourage you to go back to the previous video if you didn't see it on how Jesus handles controversy, because there's some nice rabbinical stuff there, and you get some background on the rabbis' adding of additional commandments. And so there's kind of a reasoning here, and there's even how they determined which things could be done on the Sabbath and which couldn't. So that's very useful. So if you didn't get to see that, it's great background for questions you might have related to the section above in the beginning of chapter 12. Let's dig into this one, at least for now, okay? I talked to you about chi. Chi is a Greek word that can have several meanings. Interestingly enough, though, Matthew continues to use chi as what we call the vav consecutive. Now that's fancy, but how do you knit a story together? Well, you have the next, right? Little Red Riding Hood, and she sat on the bed, and then behold, the bears came in next, and we understand a sequence in a story. There's a way Hebrew does that. And so chi is just a translation of and it doesn't always work real well. When you read the genealogy in Matthew, it says, and so begot so, and so begot so and so. Well, it's not really and, it's a vav consecutive. It's putting a little prefix in front of the word, and then there's a way of doing this depending on which verbs are connected, and it gets a little complicated, all right? But what ends up happening here is there are features of grammar related to the verbs, and this Hebrew letter that acts as a preposition, but it acts as a consecutive in certain cases. So you have a vav that connects, like our and, but, or, okay, and then you have a Hebrew letter, it's the same Hebrew letter, that acts as a consecutive. And that gets a little complicated, but we learn to do that. And we learn to end up understanding the grammar behind that. But it really makes Matthew sound funny during that genealogy. And so begot so and so, and so begot so and so. Kind of hard to read. And it's like, what's with all the ands? And really, it's sort of like next or then. Um, and so, better translations will take into account this feature of Hebrew grammar that's being represented by the Greek word, and they'll sort of smooth it out. All right. But you need to understand that Matthew's writing is very Hebraic because that chi is really him translating the verb consecutive into a Greek form. And that sort of grammar, okay, is indicative of a Hebraic sort of way of doing things. So, behold is simply calling attention. There was a man with a withered hand. Now, this is in the synagogue, and they ask him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Um, and you might say, well, that's an obvious one, right? Um, but they want to accuse him. This is like, when did you stop beating your mother? All right. They're trying to give him a question that he can't answer without incriminating himself, because they had definite laws over what you could do and couldn't do. Now, better commentators point out that rabbinical law did allow for certain things. And some commentators will say, well, Jesus fell within the bounds of rabbinical law. The only thing that's interesting about this is there one or two possibilities. One, Matthew didn't know what he was talking about. I don't think that's the case. Or the Pharisees really were trying to set him up. Um, so while there seems to be rabbinical law which may have allowed for this, whether it was allowed within every school, remember there was Hillel and Shammai, there were some different rabbinical schools, or whether they were just going to take the opposite position, uh, is really the answer. But the point is, their motives are not good. And we've seen this before in the previous section. Okay, at the beginning, the Pharisees do the same sort of thing. Look at what your disciples are doing. It's not lawful on the Sabbath. And we talked about how central the Sabbath was to Jewish thinking at the time. It was one of those key markers. So this is a big heavy. This isn't a small commandment. Interestingly enough, most Reformed Jews are not going to be very strict over the Sabbath. Conservative Jews might be somewhat strict. It's your Orthodox Jews that are the strictest observers of the Sabbath. And that's why the Sunday Saturday issue occasionally comes up among certain groups, even like the Seventh day Adventists and stuff, all because the Sabbath is given this sort of priority, even to this day. And the point is that even the Greek is really highlighting the fact that they had an ulterior motive. And that's why I stuck the clause up there. And what I want to point out to you is the first word of the clause, okay? And it's pronounced hina, and it always indicates a purpose, or at least, I shouldn't say always, because I'm going to find some place in Beyond Greek Basics by Wallace where he's going to point out that there's an exception to a Greek rule, which does happen. The point here is it's what's called a purpose clause with the hina in it. And so the purpose is being indicated very clearly in the Greek. Matthew is indicating that this is really the purpose. Their real purpose was to trap Jesus. Okay, they aren't asking to understand. Now, we have to be careful in apologetics because sometimes people are asking questions they don't want the answers to. And so I will caution somebody about Cran's law. Cran's law is this: never ever ask a question you don't want the answer to. One, because you're going to get an answer, and two, because you're probably not going to like it. Okay? But Matthew is letting us know the intent of the Pharisees. He wants us to know very clearly that this is opposition. This is not a friendly questioning. He also wants us to know that the Pharisees don't have honest intentions in their questioning of Jesus. Already the battle lines have started to be drawn. They don't like him. They still don't like him. When I look at Rabbi Singer, I see a modern, I see this sort of deceptiveness. I see this sort of duplicity. They just had already sort of were making up their minds, and they wanted the people to side with them, and they wanted to discredit Jesus. And so they asked this question. Now, Jesus is going to use their own halacha. Sometime we'll have a little nosh of Hebrew on the word halacha. But you can just understand it as practice right now. So he's going to use their own rabbinical methods. Now, this is what I love about Jesus. He had an ability to question them. He had an ability to question them and use their own methods to discredit them. And this is where Jesus is the greatest of, I don't want to use the term apologist, but he is the greatest at making very clear the rightness of what, of the position being expounded here. He's just brilliant. And I don't know how Singer misses the brilliance, just because he, like the Pharisees, doesn't much like the answer and probably doesn't much like the brilliance, okay? Here's what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't defend himself. I want you to notice that, because that's a temptation that even I fall into. It's very hard in apologetics not to defend yourself. Jesus's wisdom is in the way he deals with this. He shows, and he doesn't defend himself, but he shows from their own practice that the answer to the question should be yes. You want to know what the answer to the question is? Let's look at what you would do in a different situation. What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, does not lay hold of it and lift it out? Now you're helping that sheep and technically doing what could be considered work in lifting that sheep out. And yet none of these guys, as sensible men, knowing the value of a sheep, and just in that day, would have left that sheep in a hole for the rest of the Sabbath and went back to get it. There are a lot of problems with doing that. And so he's going to use their own methods here. This is an obvious, this is what you would do. Okay? Now he's going to use, and that one could be taken either way, he's going to use a light to heavy argument. If nothing else, through going through Matthew and doing this, you should begin to be able to spot light to heavy arguments. There are two things, if you have a Bible highlighter, that's really worthwhile to do, is every time you see an imperative indicative, God is like this, therefore he commands this. I am holy, therefore you be holy. And you see a clear command tied to God's character like that. Okay? As your Father in heaven causes the rain to rain on the just and the unjust, blah, 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 then you, I would highlight those things. So start highlighting your indicative imperatives. The other thing is look for the light heavy arguments. If this, then that. If this smaller thing is true, how much more true is that? If this larger thing is true, how much more true is the smaller thing? Look for those light to heavy arguments. You're going to see a ton of them. Jesus uses them. This is a very Jewish way of arguing, and Matthew records them. And remember that Matthew is very Hebraic in its thinking. So what's the light heavy argument? Well, how much more value then is a man than a sheep? See, if you would do this for a sheep, which is of lesser value, then you would certainly do good towards a man. You're doing good towards the sheep. I mean, the sheep's being helped out here. It's in a dangerous and precarious situation, and you could lose that sheep. And you're taking care of your livestock. Well, if a man's more valuable than a sheep, how much more should you take care of another human being on the Sabbath? And his therefore statement is the conclusion. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath, because you would do good towards a sheep. I'm doing good towards a man. The general principle here is it's okay to do good on the Sabbath. In fact, you should do good on the Sabbath. Now, why does Jesus get the idea that sheep are more valuable than people? Now, before you laugh, understand that from a Carl Sagan point of view, that is not true. Rabbi, uh, not rabbi, I'm thinking there's a college professor uh, that basically made the statement, he called it speciesism, and he said that human beings should consider themselves no more valuable than their local dog or cockroach. In fact, he's advocated euthanasia and other things. Okay? And his argument is that human beings are just another animal. So if you put a dog out of its misery, you need to go ahead, shoot people, and put them out of their misery. I mean, that's his argument. So don't assume that that's really taken anymore. That was commonly accepted because of the residual effects of a Judeo-Christian worldview. But under Darwinism, people are not more valuable than sheep. They're just more complicated. And there's no reason to believe that a life form that's more complicated than another life form is necessarily more valuable. And so you need to understand that, yes, Peter Singer, someone help me out. Excellent. He is what I'd call a basic academic nutcase. But that's his junky thing. And he's operating from his worldview. So we know this, but we need to know why this is true. There's a reason that people are more valuable. And it's got to be grounded in something. You know, the idea when I run into people on the street who say this is true, and I say, well, why is it true? Well, it's just common sense. No. Truth is grounded in something. Truth has a foundation. Right and wrong are grounded in something. If they're not, it doesn't matter. So Jesus is assuming his audience knows something. What does he think his audience knows? He thinks his audience knows the Bible, and there's even Talmud from this, part of scripture that was understood. So there was Bible and there was some decent Talmud. We'll get to that. Okay? That just reinforced. It was just built off of this. God said, let us make man. Now, man there means mankind. We know that Adam comes, mankind or man, comes in two types, male and female. The Bible even says that. Let us make man in our image, and he made them male and female. He created them. Man is not just one type. Man comes in two kinds, male and female. They're both human. They're both Adam in that sense. Isn't that kind of interesting? Women are Adam too, in a biblical sense. Adam is used to, yes, refer to individual men, but there's this idea of humankind. We do the same thing. Okay? In our likeness, let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Why does man have authority over the animal kingdom? Because we were given it. We may misuse it because we're sinners, and we do, but the reality is humankind has authority over animal kind to a certain extent because God gave it. Now, it's limited and it's tarnished, but it's still there. Okay, remember what I said before. Jesus's ethics were creational and redemptive. Now, I said that when I talked about the was Jesus a Democrat? You can go back and find it. And I pointed out that Jesus's ethics were creational and they were redemptive. And that's the core of that. And so here's humankind. We're made uniquely in the image of God. By the way, we're made in the image of God. We're not monkeys. We couldn't be monkeys because monkeys aren't made in the image of God, and we are made in the image of God. And so we are not your average monkey. And so if you're looking for my understanding, do I believe in adaptation? Yes. Do I believe that we all of a sudden turned into a more complex animal than apes? No, I don't, because we're uniquely put in the image, made in the image of God, and you don't find that being true, even though you might love Fluffy, your dog. Your dog Fluffy was not uniquely made in the image of God, but your dog Fluffy can be a wonderful dog. Now, whereas Avodah Zarah is probably the worst of Talmud, Pirkei Avot is probably the best of Talmud. I didn't come up with that, but I really like it. That was come up through Greg Haig, who was one of my professors at the Feinberg program. And I thought, what a great sort of summary statement. And so I have a copy of Pirkei Avot. In fact, I have several copies of Pirkei Avot. There is some wonderful stuff in Pirkei Avot. It's downright biblical, and it's good stuff. And so, not all of the Talmud is bad. The Talmud has much bad, but occasionally they say something that's true based on a Bible verse. Go figure. He used to say, "Beloved is humankind, for it was created in the image of God, but still more beloved in that it was made known to humanity, that it was created in the image of God, as it is said, in the image of God he made man." And they go to Genesis 9:6. All right, but we can see the same truth is contained, and that's Bergson and Malcolm Fish, Pirkei Avot. It's a nice English translation and available through Logos Bible software. So we are distinctly different than the rest of the animal kingdom, being made in the image of God. This wasn't questioned in Jesus' day. Nobody ever thought like we do now. Nobody in Jesus' day had 16 genders. Nobody in Jesus' day questioned that human beings were uniquely made in the image of God. Let me tell you a joke, though, and I think this is useful if you're talking to an evolutionist or an atheist. Just by way of distinguishing worldviews, you could say, "Can I tell you a little joke that helps explain the difference between the ramifications of my worldview and the ramifications of yours as far as the worth of human beings?" So there's this young Jewish guy and this old Jewish gentleman on a plane. They're going to Israel. And there's this stewardess. She comes over to the older Jewish man and she says to him, "Are you doing okay? You feel okay? Can I get you something?" And she's not ignoring the other guy, might turn to him. And a few minutes later, she's back at the older guy saying, "You look uncomfortable. Do you need a pillow, a blanket? Can I get you an extra drink?" And she's seeing all this attention this older Jewish man's getting. He's not getting so much of it. She's not being rude, but she's constantly checking on this older gentleman. And so the younger Jewish gentleman becomes kind of curious. What's the story here? We're sitting in the same part of the airplane. Why is this guy getting special treatment? Is he famous or something I don't know about? What is this? So he turns to the older gentleman and says, "I can't help noticing that stewardess is very attentive to you. Um, Not that I'm jealous, but I am a little curious. Are you famous or something?" He says, No, let me explain. "That's my granddaughter. My granddaughter believes that we came from Adam. So to her, I'm older. I'm one step closer to Adam. If you take the other point of view, you're one step closer to a monkey." Didn't tell it exactly perfectly, but the idea is that if you begin with the premise that we came from monkeys, then human worth is totally changed. Why did ancient societies, particularly Jewish society, have a reverence for the elderly? Because they believed that the elderly, one, had lived longer and acquired some wisdom, should in the process, and two, they were one step closer to the patriarchs and to Adam. And so they tended to look that way. But if you believe in evolution, well, your older folks are just one step closer to being a giant monkey. And so there are ramifications. What people think matter. And none of this was questioned in Jesus' day. They believed human beings were created by a direct act of God. We did not evolve through gradual anything. And so Jesus could use this thing that a sheep is of less value than a man. Because they knew Genesis, there was this is an older section. Pirkei Avot is older. Some of it may have existed in Jesus' day, but they had this clear understanding. Nowadays, we don't even have that, which is scary because when you move those boundary stones, you really do some damage. And so I say, well, the reasons that I am not an evolutionist, well, that's one of them. Okay. I firmly believe that human value comes from being made in the image of God. And I believe that evolution makes people less than people. And so even if it wasn't questionable in some way scientifically, it would be definitely not advisable morally. And by the way, I believe moral truth is just as much truth as scientific truth is. In other words, I don't believe that scientific truth is higher than moral truth. I believe that moral truth has equal value with any other type of truth. So, Jesus' conclusion is that it is okay to do good on the Sabbath, that it is right to do good on the Sabbath. His basic moral standard is that doing good on the Sabbath is totally lawful, totally acceptable. This is going to form the basis of what he does. And by the way, he does do good on the Sabbath. He heals the man with the withered arm. And by the way, the man with the withered arm gets healed. Now, that's highly significant. If Jesus was sitting by healing on the Sabbath and trying to invoke God in doing what God did not desire, Jesus could not expect God's power to accompany what he was doing. In other words, he is again demonstrating his messianic authority, and he's demonstrating it on the Sabbath, demonstrating it is okay to do good on the Sabbath, and demonstrating his authority over the Sabbath. Jesus doesn't just say the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he proves the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And God affirms his position. He affirms his position by allowing or permitting the demonstration of messianic power on the Sabbath. See, there's a question that has to be asked. If Jesus was not the Messiah and he was not Lord of the Sabbath, then why could he heal on the Sabbath? Miraculously. Now, Rabbi Singer would say the Gospels are false. I would say, prove that. Prove this man wasn't healed. You can say you don't believe the Gospels, but can you prove this incident did not occur? And can you explain it if it did occur? Because Jesus' demonstration here backs up his statement in 12:8 and backs up his messianic authority and also shows God's approval of this healing on the Sabbath. And so that's highly significant and it can't be ignored. God furthers the things that God desires. Doesn't that make sense? Why would you expect anything else? So let's talk about some takeaways for tonight. Sanctifying time. The Sabbath is about sanctifying time, according to Abraham Herschel. He talks about sanctifying time and space, that Judaism focused on sanctifying time and space. Now, why space? Remember that the Garden of Eden was lost. If you look at your Bible that way, if you look at your Bible as the restoration of fellowship of God and man and the sanctifying or re-sanctifying of space. Remember, the earth was created to be inhabited. We were supposed to be vice regents. The earth was going to be holy, ruled by God's vice regents under him, displaying his character. If you go back to Revelation at the end, what do you see? The sanctifying of space. Well, there's a sanctifying of time. Is the sanctifying of time the most important thing? Well, not in a ceremonial way. It won't take the place of displaying the character of God and being a proper image bearer. Let me tell you a story. I think I told this before, but Jewish teaching, you got to have a story, right? Every Jewish person has a story. The names have been changed to protect the guilty. A man I knew was very into Christian Sabbath ease legalism. He believed, first of all, that Sunday was the Sabbath. The problem with that is Sunday's not the Sabbath, it's the Lord's Day. I don't doubt that it's the Lord's Day, and I don't doubt that believers met on it, but I know it's not the Sabbath. I know how to count. He apparently was replacement theology, and we had a go-around about that because that is not good. All right? But of course, his children were not allowed to do anything much but play a few board games and stay very still and be dressed in their Sunday best all of the day because it was the Lord's Day. And how dare you do anything on the Lord's Day? You do not do anything on the Lord's Day. You do not move. You do not have fun. You do not get out of your dress clothes. You just observe the Lord's Day. And he was very legalistic about that. And so he came over to our house and was invited over. And of course, we did not work against his convictions. That is your conviction. That is fine. If one man regards one day over another, Paul says, let him be convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day over the other days does so to the Lord. He who regards every day the same does so to the Lord. Check out Romans 14. We did not want to scandalize this brother. All right. But that legalism did very little for his character and his family's character. All right. He ended up displaying a level of harshness that might not have been there if he was more grace filled. And so he kept the letter of the Sabbath, but he did not keep the spirit of the Sabbath. And that's my point. And so this gentleman, in trying to do what God said, violated who God is. Catch that. That's a refrigerator magnet saying in the making. If I just put it this way, the refrigerator magnet saying is, in doing what God said, never do it in a way that violates who God is. So, that's the first thing we learn. Ceremony without substance is pure legalism and it's poison to the Christian. Our goal is to reflect God's character. Any convictions that help with that we have, that's fine. Any issues we're sensitive to, that's fine. Any burdens we choose to pick up. Again, do we keep Passover? Yes, we do. Do I demand everyone else keeps it? No. That's just a personal sort of choice. But I need to be careful. The minute I demand that of others, I end up running. And if I do so in a way that becomes overly harsh, and that is a temptation, having grown up in a Jewish background, I run that risk. So I need to be careful, and so do you. Let our doing not betray our being. Loving God and loving your fellow man is the fulfillment of the law, while regulation keeping and checklisting is not. The law is good. It told us about God. Keeping God's commands is important. But if you want to boil it down, what are the two greatest commands according to Jesus? Loving God and loving your fellow man. If your regulation keeping interferes with your loving, you need to make an adjustment. But we need to understand what the fulfillment of the law is, and it's not in the checklisting. And Jesus is going to be very good at pointing out these guys' hearts were wrong. They were going to make this man with a withered arm suffer with the withered arm when he could be fully restored for the sake of the Sabbath. God's greater concern was the restoration of that man spiritually, and God's compassion would want to see that man restored physically more than a simple checklisting off the Sabbath. So that's where we're going. And of course, we said that. Jesus demonstrated his interpretation was true and his claim to deity was true. A few things to go ahead. Well, let's keep going here, okay? The other thing we need to understand is the Pharisees' plan. And remember that they did not like what he did. They wanted to accuse him. They want to kill him. We're going to get to that. Something to pay attention to, when somebody's demeanor is demonic, their doctrine has problems. Can you try that? If their demeanor is demonic, their doctrine has problems. I didn't say that they slip and they get angry. All right? But for somebody from a cult wants to go into a delicatessen and play shoot 'em up, I already know their doctrine's off. We'll deal with Matthew 12, 14, and 15, and I'll go back to that point at a later time, because really that should be the end of this pericope. Well, let's do it, because really it is the end of this pericope. 14 and 15, the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him, but Jesus knew it and he withdrew from there, and a great multitude followed him, and he healed them all. What do these guys want to do after a healing? Are they happy the guy was healed? And even if they're not happy the guy was healed, because they don't like him, okay? Wanting to kill the healer is not a proper response to a healing. If your doctor heals you of a disease and you pull out a knife and knife him because he healed you, that's not a proper response. That would be returning evil for good. And returning evil for good is evil. Returning evil for good is evil. The honorable thing is returning good for good. But let's look at who's a murderer, okay? The devil is a murderer, Jesus said. In fact, Jesus said the devil was a murderer from the beginning. Their plot to murder Jesus, lying in wait, is acting like the devil. Now, why did I say lying in wait? That means a deliberate attempt to premeditatively kill them. Not a crime of passion, but you're You're plotting it out, and you're waiting for them to come so you can just nail them. Okay? And it's actually a violation of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Hebrew Scriptures say that lying in wait is sin. So the Pharisees were violating the Torah while trying to uphold the Torah. And that's my point with that. They were acting like their father. Jesus knew it. He withdrew from there. And a great multitude followed him. You'll notice the word multitude in 15 is in brackets. Why? You notice the little thing here? I have a New King James. It says NU, multitudes is disputed. This gets into textual criticism. I don't want to spend a lot of time with this, but if you do have a Bible, you're going to see this occasionally. Most of you are just veterans, okay? And you might already know this, but again, I think I have word of at least one or two friends that watch these later. There is textual differences that do occur. I'm not going to, pretend it doesn't happen. Variations in the Greek New Testament do not indicate errors. Muslims pounce on this stuff. They don't indicate errors. I can't go into a lot of detail. There's a lot that deals with dealing with manuscripts, okay? What is important is that there's this idea that we get one Greek manuscript which descended from heaven like some King James only individuals are tempted to think. And that's not accurate, okay? There is not a perfect text. There are texts, okay? Because they were copied. For the sake of scholarship, biblical interpretation, the following points do need to be made, just for the sake of understanding this, okay? The received text is called the Texticus Receptus. It was the standard for about 2,000 years in Europe, but more manuscripts started being found. They weren't false manuscripts, they were just manuscripts. Okay, like the Dead Sea Scrolls were found later. They were there, we just didn't know they were there. It wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that a serious challenge was mounted to the preeminence of the received text. Through Brooks, Fawcett, Westcott, and Hort. They recognized the existence of text types. So they started saying, well, as we're finding new texts, do I see something? Can I learn something from this? And they figured out that there were text families. All right. Now, these don't represent errors, but you do have to be aware of them. And so this sometimes comes up with the received text. The result was that the earlier versions ended up creating an idea that, wow, there's more to this than we thought there was. The Textus Receptus is regarded or represents what's called the Byzantine family of manuscripts. All right. Modern manuscripts such as the Nestle Ellen 27, which I use for the Greek text, and the United Bible Society's 4th edition underlie modern English translations and are used most often in college and seminaries. We actually had the text and had to look at it. They don't always match up with the received text, all right? Because they rely on several text families, not just the Byzantine. I could do a whole show on this. The bottom line is that's why you're seeing that in brackets. That's what it means that it's disputed. Don't worry about it, but you do need to understand. It has to do with the way the Bible was preserved, but it was preserved. And I could do some more on that. But you just need to know, because it's in brackets. And if someone runs into this, I want them to know that, one, their Bible's accurate, and two, there's a reason it's in brackets. And it has to do with the text families. Okay. Jesus explains the spirit of the law and properly interprets Sabbath law. He is its authoritative interpreter. In other words, what Jesus said about the Sabbath was what it was. True piety and devotion is about exhibiting the image of God. We've talked about that, but that's a good way to remember it. Okay? Legalism and false piety consist in placing rules above God. If I place rules above God, now, by the way, Judaism does tend to, I mean, there's some suffering from this that occurs in Judaism where the Torah and Talmud are actually placed above God, in a sense. If you're doing God's will, you're doing what God wants, and God gets to be the rule giver. And if God's not in control of your life on some level, then, and you're just doing, like a Catholic person who isn't really saved goes to church a dozen times and follows all the Catholic rules and says all the Hail Marys, and they're very obsessed with keeping the rules, but that's placing the rules above God. Okay? Valuing the rules should not be more important than doing God's will. And God's will, in this case, Jesus knew from the Father, was to heal the man, regardless of whether it was the Sabbath. So we want to be careful. True piety is doing what God wants you to do and reflecting Him. False piety is involved with trying to do the outward without any real desire to be connected with God inwardly, or to display it. And our sister Radical Love said it best, the goal is to reflect God's character. If you lengthen that out just right, you got another refrigerator magnet saying, right? So we got to look at Jesus's piety. The end got a little funky, but I wanted to show you that the Pharisees who were trying to keep God's law were actually violating God's law in attempting to lie in wait for Jesus for keeping God's law. Isn't that kind of ironic? The Pharisees who were trying to keep God's law were violating God's law by intending to kill Jesus in order to keep God's law. So, that brings us through to tonight. I really appreciate the encouraging comments. I'm going to look back up because I'm kind of curious as to the Nash of Hebrew and how that all went, because that was the first time trying one of those. So, and there's some great comments in here. I really appreciate it. But I will look back through here. I am thrilled to see some people I haven't seen for a while. So it was great to have, it's always great to have the folks that are here. But it's been a while since I've seen Built for Speed 101 and brother Brian. It is great to have you back. Every so often I don't see people for a while and I miss them. I'm thrilled for everyone that's here, but it's fun to see people kind of come back. So, well, we're over. I'm not saying we're over the time, but it's probably getting late there. Ooh, ho ho! Somebody got the Hebrew for shamar in there. That's nice. Okay, Hebrew keyboards are great. What can I say? Let's see. I might be able to get away with this tonight. Let's see. Da, 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 da. I'm trying. There we go. Let me see. Let me wish you all to do. There we go. Say shalom to everybody. So. Oh, ha, I forgot to put it back on English keyboard. Haha. Well, you guys were seeing what happens when you don't turn off your Hebrew keyboard and you leave it on Hebrew and you type English. Well, that was fun. Well, good night, all. I'm going to end the stream. You guys are wonderful. I will see you soon and begin working on next week shortly. I've got a Sunday school to get done and some work on a dissertation to keep working on and some other things, but I think I can do this. I'm going to just kind of give a wave bye. It's not the princess wave. I guess it's the Jeff Cran in front of the camera wave. And just say bye.